Alright, we're back. This is the second video for this week. Since we're finishing up with some basic Scruggs ideas in the context of a tune, I thought I would do a second video to give you some more examples of mixing the licks together. We're working a 9-pound hammer, and we just used the boogie woogie lick with a couple of amps to fill out that measure, and then we tried some two-finger ideas. Now let's take a couple of the other licks that we've talked about and see if we can mix them in the context of the tune. And again, remember from the previous video that we have a measure of G, a measure of C, then half a measure of G, half a measure of D, and then basically that repeats again. And that's the same for the choruses and the verses. There's no difference between the two. So instead of doing the boogie woogie lick and the two-finger lick, let's try to use the scrolling idea and this lick in the context of 9-pound hammer. So again, let me fire the digital metronome up. I'm using this one because with me singing and playing at the same time, I don't think my wind-up's going to be loud enough. So let me bring the digital metronome up. And again, I'm just going to do the same thing as I did in the previous video. We know now what the chord progression is, and we know how long each chord change lasts. Now we just need to figure out licks that will fit into the context of those time limits per chord. Now again, you can modify licks to make them fit specific chord changes in songs. You notice the two-finger lick I modified a little bit in the previous video to make it work. I'm going to try to play the licks verbatim if I can without modifying them too much, except when we come to places like those half measures where the changes are shorter. We may have to change some things up. So I'm going to start with the top of the chorus again, because the chorus is easy to remember instead of the verses. And I'm going to use the scrolling lick to cover the first measure of G. Ready? It's a 9-pound hammer. Oop, I'm going to turn this metronome up. There we go. It's a 9-pound hammer. It's a little too. Okay, again there, that's just the scrolling idea played out of any number 2 chord shape. I'm using it in the context of a G, so I have it located where a G chord lives. It's a 9-pound hammer. It's a little too. And that fits nicely, just scrolls through the chord change. Now C's coming up. We know C is one measure. Instead of the boogie woogie idea followed by a couple of amps like we did in the previous example, I'm going to move the same idea up to here. It's a 9-pound hammer. It's a little too heavy for my... Now I rushed a little bit because I'm trying to think. But basically we did the same thing that we did in the first video. We reproduced the same backup for both G and C chord changes because both chord changes lasted the same amount of time. Now you might not want to do this in the context of playing a tune in a band or a jam session because it may get monotonous, but the whole idea behind this video is to have you practice something and get good at it and keep it in time. So this will make it easy. You don't have to think of anything new. You can just reproduce the same idea over a new chord change. So let's go back to the top. It's a 9-pound hammer. It's a little too heavy, buddy, for my... Alright, now we're coming up on that half measure of G. And we could shorten this lick for my size, and then D, honey, for my... You know, we could take that scrolling idea and cut it in half, and it would work well. Or we could switch back to the two-finger backup. What I'm going to do here is just vamp, because I don't want to use the scrolling lick 4 times in a row. If you want to take the scrolling lick and cut it in half so that it lasts 2 beats for both G and D, that's fine. That would be a good practice. But I'm going to use vamps to fill those areas out in this example. It's a 9-pound hammer. It's a little too heavy, honey, for my size, honey, for my size. Roll on, buddy, with your load of coal. example, in terms of metronome off, was actually to use the scrolling lick in a couple of places, and then when I had the half measure, instead of shortening that lick, which you can do, I just decided to vamp. And then you noticed in between the first half of the course and when I repeated the music for the second half of the course, I used the boogie woogie lick and the vamp. So I kind of grabbed an idea from the previous video and put it in here. Now let's try to use the lick that covers all three chord changes. Now to do that, we need to figure out a place to put it in. The only thing tricky about this lick is that it feels better and works much better if you play it on the first off beat. So if you remember back to that video, I actually started the lick not on the one, but on the first and. One and. Because it is kind of a bluesy, boogie woogie lick, and blues licks usually feel better sometimes when they're played starting on the off beat, which adds to that funky kind of syncopation thing that blues licks have sometimes. So now the only tricky thing about doing this in the context of 9-pound hammer is I have to figure out how to slide that in on the offbeat. So it's something we have to work on, but that's what the video is for, right? So let me go ahead and try to sneak that in between, to make it easier, I'm just going to play vamps, and then I'll show you where I'll decide to put the licks in. And I'm just going to use this one lick in this example. So let me start the metronome up. It's a 9-pound hammer. It's a little too heavy for my size, honey, for my size. Well, roll on, buddy, with your load of coal. How can I roll when the wheels won't go? Let's do that again. It's a 9-pound hammer. It's a little too heavy for my size, honey, for my size. Well, roll on, buddy, with your load of coal. How can I roll when the wheels won't go? So hopefully you can get the drift of what I was doing there. If you notice, you would hear the metronome click on that one beat. I'd wait for it to go by and then start the lick, so trying to find that off beat. So that's an example of using the lick that we talked about that encompasses all three chord changes as far as the shapes go. So we've basically covered every lick, and I didn't show many variations because, again, I want to keep this as simple as possible, and always work in the context of the chord changes for the tune. Make sure that you know, first of all, what the chord change is, G, C, and D for 9-pound hammer. Then you have to determine how many measures each chord change lasts, which is going to dictate how you can form licks and put them in there. And like I said in the previous video, if you do this long enough and get good at it, you get an internal ability to just feel, oh, this lick lasts just long enough, I can slide it in that chord change. Or this lick would sound good, but it's not quite long enough, or it's too long, so I'm going to modify it to make it fit. And that's something you get from experience. So always work your way up. Start with something simple and then build out. So for the rest of this video, I'm just going to continue to play 9-pound hammer and use some of these licks. And I'll see you next week. Thanks. It's a 9-pound hammer.